right, perfect. So welcome to, this is the final session of the day, isn't it? Yeah, I think it is. I hope so. I'm ready for a party soon. Right. So what do you get if you mix one rapidly changing startup, one data analyst, one data engineer, and a theory that Azure Synapse Analytics could be the way to go for gaining business insights? We actually had no idea, but we decided to give it a go. Welcome to Lessons Learned, Implementing Azure Synapse Analytics in a Rapidly Changing Startup. My name is Cathrine Wilhe, or Cathrine Wilhe. I work as a tech lead and senior data management and analytics consultant in Skill in Norway. You can find me on Twitter at CathrineW, and I blog on cathrinew.net.
Hello, my name is Helle Norman. I work as a data magician in the Norwegian startup company called LOA.
Data magician. Can you explain a little bit about how you got that title in LOA?
Well, I was the 5th employee, so I guess there wasn't room for like a data analyst, a data engineer, and a data scientist. So that's basically just doing everything that has to do with data. And also doing like cleaning data of the source system and stuff like that.
So you were basically the data team when you started?
Yeah.
Yes.
And before I started working in LOA, I only worked in like big corporations doing large-scale data warehouse solutions. So I was kind of curious to see how it would be working in a startup. And also I wanted to contribute to the green shift, as we call it in Norway. So last year, I think it was 65% of all new cars were electrical. So the thing we provide, or LOA provide, is EV charging for like multi-unit charging facilities. So everything from setting up the facility to doing the operations when it's done. Yep.
Yeah. And then, like you said, you were working mainly in large corporations before, you know, big enterprises, traditional data warehouses, on-premises mainly, and then you shifted over to a startup where you were employee number 5. So can you talk us through a little bit the startup way and how you worked and how that was different from what you did in the past?
Well, it kind of felt a bit chaotic and not like making a lot of solutions automated, more like ad hoc, finding the right answer here and now and then throwing it away after. And sort of navigating the market, trying to find the correct business model, developing the product in the right direction. And also the whole business is new, like not just for us, but the industry. So yeah, and also the technology with the EV interface is new, so there's a lot of things going on there. Yeah, so basically trying to just find the right direction.
And then the methodology was different as well for you.
So that was, I think, a month before I started the job. My boss came to my doorstep holding this book called The Lean Startup. So basically, the way we work in LOA doing Lean Startup is using the build, measure, learn cycle. So the idea is that you should never develop anything big, but try to start small based on some kind of hypothesis. To see what the users actually want. So you build like the absolute minimum, and then you test that to see if the hypothesis was correct, and then you learn from that and repeat. Yeah, so that's how we've done like product development in LOA, and also I wanted to try that when I was making the first analytics solution. Yeah, so I had some hypotheses about like what the main metrics would be, and also regarding the technical solution. So this is kind of the way I've been used to working, but we didn't have time for that. So my boss basically said, like, how fast can you get something up and running? So I thought this would be a better idea. So that's kind of one of the flexibilities of Power BI, that you can take the data directly into the model and not have a middle storage, so everything is stored in the service and nothing in between. And I had just heard about this, and I wanted to give it a go. So I was actually able to deliver something, kind of fast, a month or two. And then, like, the minimum viable analytics solution was kind of picking the low-hanging fruits. I had to do some trial and error because connecting to the web connector, like doing JSON, that wasn't that easy, but it was doable. And I was basically just breaking all the best practices, having like no star scheme. And I think maybe you'll see that later.
Speed, speed, speed.
Yeah,
just get
it's
things
all
done.
about it's all about the speed.
So the things that you made, you had, you picked the low-hanging fruits. You had a company where the focus was on speed and get things done. And then you created a couple of these minimum viable products, and you got that delivered to your business. And then you did a couple of things. Can you talk us through how, what you created and how the business users got familiar with what you did, and what does it mean to you basically be data-driven?
Yep. So the first version was distributed into teams, and actually it has been after that as well. And I really love this way of distributing it because the users are already in teams, so you don't have to ask them to go someplace else. And they kind of have the ownership to their team. And also if they were with me making a report, they would have more ownership to it and like, come and check out our Teams report in our Teams channel. So that worked really well. And also I got a lot of new requirements after this MVP.
Yeah, and then basically, just by embedding that report into Teams, the users took ownership. They figured out like, oh, hey, we can do all of these amazing things. And then they started asking for more. And for you to be, the owner of everything data, you created a report that you called the
Stalker report.
Stalker report, which is a good one. And this is important for, the startup way, and for you particularly, I think, because you were the only one working with this. And, going out and talking to each user and everything that they did, that was probably not an option for you. So then this report.
Yeah, it has helped me a lot. So this was actually a screenshot from yesterday, but so in the beginning it was just 5 or 6 users. But it helped me a lot to see which parts of the reports were actually used and should put more work into. And I think 80% of the tabs I had are already gone. So yeah, it helped me a lot. And also if someone came to me with a question, I could check if they knew about this report.
Yeah, and then, I mean, it's data-driven for you as well, so it's kind of meta-data-driven in a way. And then the good thing about this was that people started using this. They started requesting more features, more functionality. And then the downside of that was that they asked for more and asked for more functionality, which meant that you had to deliver more. And then we got to a point where, can I show them this next slide?
I think you have to.
Okay, all right, there we go. Breaking all best practices, right? So I'm not sure you can see that, but I think you can see that as a fairly complicated Power BI model. And this is probably, where you told me when I came into this project that I don't want to show you this. And that is the perfect way of working with, the lean methodology, and you just get things done until it kind of hurts.
Yeah, that's kind of the recipe. Like the absolute minimum viable product should be embarrassing to launch, and it was, at least when I showed it to you.
Yes, and now we're showing it to the entire world, so that is
great. Thank you.
And then the other thing that you mentioned was we had a couple of sources that were, slightly difficult to implement, so we ended up with quite a lot of code that we're just going to cover it slightly like that, so you don't read anything.
I think the worst are like 10 times that, so
yes.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
It's not pretty. A lot of functionality built into, code inside of the Power BI report, and this was great for quite a while when you were working in there. For first 18 months, I think.
Yeah, or I think this solution was good enough just for a few months, actually.
All right, well, speed.
Because I had to load the data into my laptop, and yeah, that had some limitations.
Yes.
So I basically had to have more than one model to be able to do what I wanted to do. But yeah, so we grew from 5 employees to 50 in the 18 months I've been here. So the requirements have gone up, and yeah, people are expecting a lot more. And basically, I couldn't like do a change to this model. It would be like 10 minutes to wait just for it to load. So it was hurting.
Yes, it was hurting. And that's when you got to the point where, you called me. You're like, can you, come in? I would like to have one more person to work with me on this data.
I saw you on this session presenting Synapse, and I thought it was kind of a long shot. So that was like the best day of my life when you said yes.
So for any
saving
of you,
my situation.
For any of you who are thinking about starting speaking, it can actually get you work as well if you do that. So it's a good tip. But yeah, that's when I came in. And we kind of took a step back because at some point you had gone from, delivering these amazing Power BI reports, you had built up the data culture and people were starting to ask more. And then we got back to, okay, this is hurting so much that we need to kind of re-implement some kind of layer in between. So for us then, and for me especially, coming into a startup culture, I had, just like you, been working for large corporations, a lot of projects on premises. So it was a fairly big shift for me as well to come into that kind of culture and to adapt to that. And especially to figure out how do I take all of these best practices that I know from the projects that I have been working on and implement these in a smaller company, a faster company, a startup. Or a scale-up, perhaps it has become recently. So we had a few things that we kind of looked at as these are important things to us, and these are our main ambitions. And the first one was to think big. It was a startup. It was, a smaller company, but with big visions and big hopes and big dreams. And at some point, scaling up from just a startup in Norway to maybe at some point become an enterprise scale global organization. And we had to keep that in mind the entire time, that everything that we did was, it had to be scalable. We had to be able to both scale up and scale out. And we wanted to use all of the best practices that we could in terms of, if you've seen the cloud adoption framework from Microsoft, but we couldn't implement all of that because at the same time, we had to start small. We needed that same speed. We couldn't spend, 3 months planning something, or we didn't have the team to launch a full cloud adoption framework-sized project. So this kind of it made it difficult for me or challenging for you as well to figure out, okay, so what do we pick? Which parts of the cloud adoption framework do we pick and choose that is important to us? And what do we have to figure out on our own? How do we find that balance? And the most important thing here was that we still had to act fast. That was the important thing. Things were happening. We couldn't spend a month talking about things because within that month, the company might have launched a new product, or, which happened at some point, changed their name, or maybe even launched in a couple of other countries, which has happened in the 3-4 months I've been there, all of those things. So you have to continuously adapt to all of this.
At some point, the product we were selling was illegal because the government changed the rules, so we had to,
Yeah, you kind of have to, adapt to that. That one is kind of difficult to go, we'll look at that in 6 months from now when we have time in our schedule, So that's where Helle and we started talking and discussing and trying to figure out, okay, how do we solve this? So we looked at Azure Synapse Analytics. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, this is an all-in-one platform. Previously, we had all of these separate services. So we had things like storage accounts and data lakes. We had data warehouses. We had pipelines through Azure Data Factory, other products as well, like machine learning. And all of these things had been collected and gathered and kind of packaged up into one neat product from Microsoft. And we looked at this and we considered multiple options, for me especially coming from the Azure Data Factory world in terms of data integration? Do we choose that, or do we look at Azure Synapse? And our kind of decision there was to let's just go for it. Let's try. And fortunately, I think for both of us, but mainly for me coming in as a consultant, with the feeling of I have to deliver value here, we had excellent backing from the CEO, from top-level management, who told us very explicitly, just try this. If it hurts, that's great. We just have to adapt to this. We're expecting you to build things that we might have to change in a month from now, and having that kind of backing from upper management and kind of being allowed as well to try things and see if this works. And for them to be aware that, this is probably going to hurt if we want to try bleeding technology, but they did that in all parts of the company, not just us, but app developers and website developers as well, which meant that it was also really cool to start working in a company like that, where you got to try the new things, and it wasn't a failure if you failed. It was just, okay, we learned something, let's try the next thing. So what we looked at there was to go from basically the tech stack that you used, where you had cut that middle tier and you were left with sources going directly into Power BI. And we were like, okay, let's re-implement this, but let's do it in a different way than that traditional stack of using a large-scale enterprise data warehouse with heavy data modeling, or to use analysis services with that layer in between. How can we kind of do this but still maintain that speed? So we looked at using Azure Synapse, and that is also built on top of Azure Data Lake. They're very tightly connected. You can't really create Synapse without having a data lake. So those were the two main components that we had. So the tech stack looked something like this, very, very simplified here. And then in terms of data movement, we chose some of the most established patterns in terms of building a data platform, where our data movement was to get all the data from our sources and then load that into a raw container or a raw area, sometimes referred to as a bronze area or a staging area, but where we get all that raw data and store that inside of our data lake. After we've done that, we take that data, we transform it, and then we store it as cleansed. Sometimes this is called enriched, silver layer, it has many names. But this is where we started to look at our data. It was still very tightly connected to the source. It was still source data, but we may have changed data types. We may have, deleted some columns that we didn't need. We may have joined a couple of columns, but it was still very close to the source. And from there, we transformed the data into the gold layer, which we decided to call application, for reasons you'll see in just a moment, also known as curated in some, if you look at the cloud adoption framework from Microsoft. So we took some of those best advice that we could get, best practices, and we implemented that, but then we kind of did it our way. So once we had that data, moved through these different areas, and we had data in raw, cleansed, and application, that opened up a couple of new possibilities for us. So the first one was kind of your area.
Yeah, so I could still keep some sources going directly into Power BI, and then we could just switch the straw.
Yeah, the connection.
The connection, one by one. And what I love about this is that we can first take data in to Power BI from cleansed, then just do a MVP or prototype to see what do we actually want to do a report on, what's interesting, and then we can take it back, do the aggregations in the application layer, and do it properly later. But then we have the business value already long before that.
Yeah, so this was basically doing what you had already done, but we were kind of moving things through the layers, but still enabling speed, still enabling that MVP mindset of building, let's see if this works. Let's see how users adopt this. So we could still pull in data from those sources, make sure that this was actually useful, this was things that we wanted to continue before we decided to transform it and actually move that data through those layers. And at this point, you might be wondering, but why didn't you just kind of keep Power BI? Because so far, we haven't really added much more value to this. And that's where the Synapse platform really starts to shine, is where we can enable data access in multiple ways. So in addition to having data in a data lake where data is stored as files in a file format, a lot of different applications like Power BI can access that directly. But we were working with some of the website developers or the application developers who needed access, and they're not really fans of data lakes for some reason. Like, they don't want to connect to the data lake directly, and that's where Synapse can kind of solve that challenge or a problem. Because in Synapse, you also have something called serverless SQL, which means that there is a serverless database, almost works like data virtualization, where you have kind of a hidden database on top of your data lake that gives you a SQL endpoint. And that means that if you are using something like SQL Server Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, or some kind of application with a connection string, you can connect to what appears to be a database. It looks like a database, it feels like a database, it looks like you're working with tables, but it is actually querying the files underneath. And that is built into the platform. And that allowed us to deliver data to our application developers, our website developers. And that's why we also chose to call this application, because it was very tailored to the purposes that we had inside of our project. In addition to that, what we saw were that inside of this Synapse platform, we enabled new features that we might use in the future. For example, machine learning scenarios. We're not there yet, but they can connect to raw data and have all of that in one location, and then we can start building out predictions, which is also supported inside of the Synapse platform. We also have, in addition to the Power BI reporting, this kind of what we call it an analysis scenario, where we can let users query the data in the way that they want to, the way that they're comfortable with. So if they are comfortable working directly with the files, with data lakes, maybe using things like notebooks, they can still do that. But if they know more SQL and they want to connect to what appears to be a database, they can do that. And both of these options were kind of enabled out of the box by using Synapse. So it gave us, many opportunities. So what worked well? What worked well for you in this case?
Well, the flexibility has been really great, and just being able to use SQL. I worked with Power Query and MScript for 1 year. That was hell, so it felt good being back on SQL.
Blunt as a Norwegian there. But yeah, we also had a unified workspace, which allowed us to work together in the same interface and the same, working on the same kind of code base, using the same applications. That worked well. I obviously had to point out integration pipelines. I am an Azure Data Factory fangirl, and that has continued into Synapse pipelines, but it does work well. It allowed us to very easily connect to the sources that we had through those pipelines and get all the data that we wanted into that platform. And then I became a serverless SQL kind of fangirl throughout this project, because being able to query and explore data using a language that I knew, SQL, was just great for us. And that kind of brings us to the next point here. What was painful for us? And that's the flip side of that coin, where Helle and I, we were both very comfortable using SQL. We knew how to do things, and then we ended up, maybe trying a little too hard to use this new technology, to use this new platform and all the new possibilities. And we listened to, all of the amazing speakers out there, all of the blog posts. Use Spark everything. Databricks. We want to use the Spark notebooks. All of this functionality is now available in the Synapse platform. So we're like, all right, let's give it a go. Let's see how this works. Spoiler alert, did not work that well, because we knew nothing about this. So on one side, it was great to be able to try it and test it, but it was also really, really painful, because even doing simple things for us turned out to be, fairly time-consuming. Trying to figure out what's the Spark query, how do you query things using Spark, what's the syntax like. Then we also encountered a few bugs in the Synapse platform, which these bugs have been shared with Microsoft, so I can also talk about them. But there is a concept of shared metadata between Spark managed tables and serverless SQL, we discovered that it's kind of one way. So what we hoped to do was that we could create tables and use SQL and have that available in Spark as well, but it was kind of just one way at that point. And in addition to wanting to use Spark and wanting to use notebooks, we also thought that we need to use Delta Lake. If you haven't heard about that, you can go and talk to some of the sponsors out here who are very big fans of Delta Lake. It's basically adding a layer on top of your data lake where you can get kind of sort of database functionality. You get what is kind of a transaction log. You can ensure consistency and make sure that you can insert, update, and delete things inside of your files without having to explicitly manage that yourself, which is a really cool technology. I think we both kind of wanted to use this. We wanted to learn this, and we still kind of do.
Time traveling sounds so cool.
Yes, time traveling as well, yes. So at any point in time, you can go and see what did my data look like at this point. So all of those features that we really wanted to try those things. But it was extra painful for us because we knew SQL. We wanted to use SQL. We knew SQL. We had to spend, like 30 minutes Googling, how do we do a group by, using PySpark or Python? We could write things in SQL. That took us 10 seconds to write a query or to do pseudocode, and then all right, let's Google, how do you do an aggregate? How do you do a top 10 with using, PySpark in this? And then the other thing was that when you're using Spark, you are working on a Spark cluster. That cluster has some overhead attached to it. So every time that we wanted to do some development, when we wanted to maybe add something new or test a query or do anything like that, we had to click on, start this Spark cluster. And then we went and got a coffee because it takes a few minutes to spin up that cluster. So even doing like those small things, it just took a lot of time for us, both because of the overhead of using Spark, but also because we had to spend so much time kind of upskilling to do that. And I think that also, we don't have big data. We do not have what is called big data. And all of these things are optimized for, big data. We had fairly small use cases. And in that case, the overhead just became a little bit too much. So at that point, we chatted, we talked to the CEO. We said that, okay, we're already at this point where, we might have to change our approach slightly. But we decided to, still stay within the Synapse world. So we basically, what is probably the obvious conclusion for those of you who are sitting here, we decided to go from, okay, let's go from this Spark mindset and go back to the SQL mindset so that we could act faster. And we kind of changed the engine and changed the approach for that. So instead of using Spark notebooks and writing code to do our data transformations, we changed back into using SQL scripts, and we operationalized those through those pipelines. So instead of having a notebook pulling in data from raw and cleansed, and then storing that in cleansed or application, we had pipelines that queried a view that we created in serverless, pulled in that data, and then stored it as well. So it was kind of the same concept, the same movement of data, just changing the engine and changing the technology.
I think I'll miss using the notebook, but at the same time, it was a huge relief to get the SQL part.
Yes. I think you and I need to have a talk with the SQL tooling team and go like SQL notebooks, because that would be great to get inside of Synapse. So when we did that, and this is very much our experience, and your mileage may vary here, but our costs went down. They went down because running Spark notebooks and running that Spark cluster, it has a cost attached to it. And it wasn't super high cost, but changing that to serverless SQL, it meant that the cost went down because, things just ran faster. That was the other side. Performance went up. So this was like a win-win situation for us.
And that was a surprise, I think.
Yeah, actually, it was, because you're thinking Spark notebooks and Spark and new technology and super fast and super performant, and then let's go back to good old SQL and create some views, and that is blazingly fast in comparison. The most important thing, though, I think for us was that development time went down. We went back to kind of feeling like we can do things again. We can do things faster. We're not stuck feeling like we're straight out of school, like we're junior developers who need to Google every single thing that we want to do. And that obviously had kind of the side effect that our confidence went back up, which was a great thing. You know, I mean, who doesn't want to feel confident in their job? So just a quick example here of what we experienced was that our pipeline runs, this is kind of an overview of the 3 parts that we had. When we ran this using Spark notebooks, we ended up, in case you can't see that, I think the total runtime was about 30 minutes that we spent. And that would have been fine if we wanted to do this, you know, once a night. It's not something that we needed to really focus on tuning. But we also experienced that, you know, our users wanted data a little more frequently. And if we wanted to run this every hour, having this run for half an hour would be, you know, just a little too much for us. And by using the same approach of moving that data through these 3 areas, we changed that to using SQL instead. And we were down to about between 8 to 10 minutes, depending on our sources and their response times. And that was a pretty dramatic, you know, performance boost for us, going from 30 to 10, and then imagine that kind of, you know, if it's scaled up, maybe we would have seen different numbers because of Spark then being a better tool. But for us, going from 30 to 10 was just, you know, amazing. And I wish I could have put the cost chart in there as well, because what we saw was, you know, if our numbers were hovering over here, and then we had a day where we decided to try data flows inside of Synapse pipelines, if any of you are familiar with those, that day our costs went through the roof. So we had a huge spike on that day, because that is an even more expensive component compared to Spark. We're like, let's try this. Looked at it, we're like, nope, we're not going to do that. So our costs went back down. They hovered a little bit, and then we had a few days where we did some more development and testing. And then after we deployed these changes, they kind of dropped down to where you could barely see them on that Azure chart. And again, we're not talking, you know, millions and billions of, you know, pounds or dollars or kroner in our case, but it was still something that affected us, and especially, you know, in a startup, we have to be very aware of the costs. So then looking at, you know, the future, where do we go from here?
Well, I don't think anyone in LA knows where we're going. Maybe in 2 years, it's the data that is the product, I'm hoping.
We don't know, and that is the honest truth. Like, things are changing so fast, and we are kind of working from month to month. And like I said at the start, when I started, it was a company in Norway called Ladeklar. After a couple of months, it was a company in 3 countries called LOA. So, you know, in that time, we kind of changed a lot of things, changed the products and the offerings. So we don't really know, and we don't really know in terms of looking at it from the data platform side either. So what we do know is that after we made those changes, there are a few things that work well.
Yeah, so performance have been good lately. It's short time to market, a lot easier since you came into my team of 1 person. Yeah, so it's high flexibility, and I feel like we're ready for whatever is coming. I feel confident.
Yeah. And then we have enabled a few use cases. So, you know, in terms of what's coming next, there are options for us there.
Yeah, so we are responsible of the data governance. So we decided to test Azure Purview for data cataloging and business glossary. And this is super important for us right now because, yeah, like I said, the whole business is new and we need to be talking about the same things. And it's just so many definitions flowing around and we need to be talking about the same things. So, yeah, that will be a lot going forward. And also just working with a data-driven culture, enabling self-service BI. I think that will be really important. And maybe machine learning. At least we will be ready for it.
Yes, and I think if we want to implement machine learning, we should expand our team to 3 because I don't think either of us are very comfortable with that. So kind of the key takeaway here for us is that working with Azure Synapse Analytics in terms of working in a startup, it is a very different way of looking at using Azure Synapse Analytics, because what you see from Microsoft marketing, what you hear from other speakers here, is that this is very much a big data analytics tool. It's a large-scale enterprise tool. And what you see in terms of use cases is, hey, look at this, how blazingly fast petabyte scale workloads are actually running. And for us, we are kind of at the opposite end of that, a small startup company. But what we learned was that, even a small company like Eloway, a startup company, can get a lot of use out of the Synapse platform. Again, looking at it, the unified workspace, having all of those different possibilities and options that we had. And like Pelle said, we know that we've got this. And if we can do it, honestly, any one of you can do it. So just make sure that you think about how are you working in your own companies, what is important to you, and then try and see, what can we take from best practices and established things like the cloud adoption framework. How can we make that work for us? Because it's not necessarily what you hear from marketing. It's not necessarily what you hear from other speakers. You need to figure out what actually works for you. So we've got this, you've got this. The only thing we don't got is that our timing was slightly off today. We are a little finishing up a little earlier, but I hope that you won't mind. We have a big party coming up. So we actually started a little earlier today, and we're hoping that you'll enjoy the SQL Bits party tonight. The one thing that I do want to say that Helle didn't know that I was going to actually say this today. She is a first-time speaker at any kind of event, any kind of conference.
She made me do it.
I forced her to do this. Never spoken at a user group. I kind of very aggressively nudged her and said that you're coming with me and speaking at SQL Bits. So this is the first time she's speaking. And I'm very proud of you, and I'm very thankful that I got the opportunity to work with you on this and also to present this. We are going to stick around for a little bit. If you have any questions or if you have any other kind of, if you want to talk to us about the way that we've been working, we'll be here. Otherwise, we're going to say, enjoy the SQL Bits party. Please help us plant some trees by submitting feedback forms, and we'll see you later today. Skål!